Has it not? Okay, there we go. All right, and in 3, 2, 1, and we are live. All right, and welcome everyone. Welcome to the Void slash this particular segment called the Stilly Show. Very nice to welcome people back after what's been quite a few months break. I'm delighted today to welcome our special guest and to give you your proper title, Phil, Dr. Phil Etherington. Afternoon, Phil. How are you feeling in these unusual times?
Yeah, good. Yeah, I've recovered from the virus at the end of last year, so I feel like one of the lucky ones. So actually feeling a lot better than I have done for a while. So yeah.
Times which we're currently living through, or at least, and I'm sure you can allude to this. It feels crazy, but nonetheless, if you put it in the long durée of history, I guess you could say, this is we've been. Would you say it's fair to say that maybe we've been living in a bit of a golden bask of quite a peaceful era, where we've got quite used to the fact that there hasn't been disruption, whereas, and this will tap into much more of your expertise, in a second. But we've been fortunate to be living in such a nice and simple and in good era. And of course, there's people who've had it tough, and I'm not trying to take away from that at all. But in general, for most people, I think there's been quite a lot of continuity, quite a lot of stability, and it feels normal. But the truth is, if you look at history, it's not normal. Most of history hasn't been like that.
Yeah, no, like you say, yeah, we've been really lucky with wars and pandemics and things in terms of like directly affecting our lives. We've been, yeah, like you say, a bit of a golden era, I guess, for in this country, but obviously in this little bubble of the world. Yeah.
For sure, and hopefully those good old days will come back. The nice little bubble that is Britain. Time will tell, but yeah, Phil, why don't you tell the audience about who you are and what your expertise is in?
Yeah, so I guess I'm a classicist. That's what I studied, well, classical civilization at university, and then during that 3 years, I got really interested in more of the Greek literature side of classics. So specialized more in that, and then I did a master's in basically the same thing, but I was studying ancient Greek to try and get up to speed with studying the ancient texts. Then sort of during that master's, I did a lot of modules on kind of later Greek literature. So a lot of Greek literature is in kind of classical Greece, like around like 5th century BC. And then as the kind of Greek culture goes along, they end up under the Roman Empire. They get kind of taken over by this occupying empire. And a lot of what I was doing was kind of looking at the Greek literature which carried on at that time, because obviously Greek culture was so influential to the Romans. They were still really interested in the kind of the Greek intellectual side, even though they were their subjects. They were still fascinated by all the culture and particularly the literature and drama from the past. So that's kind of what I did a lot of in my master's, and then that led me on into doing a PhD. And I was very lucky to get funding for that, and get loads of kind of support and go and have a fantastic supervisor to kind of guide me through that. And that was about one particular text called the Imagenes, which is like a description of ancient paintings. It's accepted to be basically a fictional, kind of like a novel, a short novel, kind of a fictional text about this man going around a gallery in Naples, and just kind of describing all these amazing kind of mythological paintings in a gallery. And again, that was kind of something that was written by a Greek under the Roman Empire, so Philostratus writing under the Roman Empire and for very educated Greeks and Romans. And there's lots of like intellectual play of like references to past texts and things in that, and lots of things that you would miss unless you were like really highly educated in the kind of the classics from like previous eras of Greek literature. So so that's kind of my background. And obviously along the way I've learned a lot about Greek and Roman history, and yeah, various aspects of that, and how they all kind of interlink, and how, I guess importantly, how they kind of influence the modern day, and how they're still discussed, or ideas from that come up in kind of modern conversations, and are sometimes useful way of looking at, you know, things that are happening today as well.
Fantastic. I mean, it's fair to say, listeners, that Phil's always studying. I mean, how old are you now, Phil? You 30?
I'm
Not
37.
on a
Yeah, 37 now. So yeah, it's actually a while ago that I finished the PhD in 2011, so 10 years ago now. And yeah, I've done various other like courses and things since then, and do a lot of reading in general. But yeah, so it's been a while, which actually reminds me, I was thinking before this, like, should I go back and look at more specific things that you do forget, things like dates, for specific dates, and battles and things like that. And I thought, actually, no, it's like, I guess I always focused more on kind of the ideas and sort of themes that run through literature and history, and these recurring aspects of ancient culture, and they're kind of more about their mindset and the psychology of it. I think that's kind of more important to me, and more of what I've taken away from my studies than like specific dates and like battles and things like that. So I was like, no, I'm not gonna go back. And that's my excuse anyway, not just being lazy, but yeah.
Definitely, yeah, for sure. And what would you say? What would you say are the biggest kind of influences that, you know, are quite clear for us to see today, from that classical era? I think, you know, the thing that would, you know, jump to most people's minds would be the influence in terms of democracy, and the influence in terms of governance. You know, for example, people have often compared the United States with Rome, both in terms of you know, the kind of cultural look, when you see, for example, gigantic American flags and eagles behind, you know, the key speakers, and also often in, like, let's say, what some people would perceive to be the kind of American ruthlessness ensuring the hegemony. Would you agree with, for example, you know, things such as democracy, or would you say it's much more than just that in terms of the influence looking at other aspects such as soft culture?
Yeah, I'd say it's well, yeah, two things. I guess the wider kind of influence, which I was struck by, like, from studying it, the literature particularly, was like how influential the classics were on so many people in Europe in like the Renaissance, and then later on, and you know, right up until not even that long ago in this country, people were, you know, learning Latin at least, and further back definitely ancient Greek, and were like massively influenced by the classics. So if you read so many things that you could read that are still classed as like modern literature, you would understand them much better if you understand the classics. So you know, the obvious example is like Ulysses by James Joyce is like one of the most famous modern novels, and that's, you know, that's basically a very strange, convoluted retelling of the Odyssey. And if you understand the, you know, all the different references in that to the Odyssey, then it enhances your understanding of the book, and that goes for so many different works of literature. So I think that's kind of one big area where I see it again and again, and obviously things like architecture and things like that. It's really, I don't know, yeah, since the Renaissance, probably European culture has been absolutely steeped in so many aspects of classics, and that's not the case now. But when we read things from 100 years ago, it is useful to realize that the people writing that often had in mind classical, you know, their classical education. The other thing is, yeah, I think democracy is a pretty big one, because it's kind of amazing to think that voting is even a thing. It's such a kind of huge achievement of human culture that you kind of take it for granted nowadays. But it was such a strange thing that developed in ancient Greece that you know, thankfully is still about today. But yeah, even the fact that it did come about was pretty amazing. And then I guess it's easy to forget that that form of democracy was quite different to the one now. Obviously, you had to have, it was the elite that could vote. Obviously, no women could vote. No, they had slavery and slaves couldn't vote, things like that. So it was a different version of the one that we have in lots of countries now. But yeah, just pretty amazing that has continued to exist, really, against the odds in some cases.
For sure. I mean, I think it's really interesting, actually. You kind of mentioned that if you read sources in terms of people who lived 100 years ago, or maybe even, you kind of look about 50, 60 years ago, and the influence that classics had upon them is quite stark. So I think a good example of that, I've studied history. I've always been keen upon particularly modern history and Second World War history. Is reading an account by General Eisenhower, who is, of course, the overall commander during the D-Day operations and the later liberation of France and invasion of Nazi Germany. He was quite heavily influenced by Hannibal in terms of the tactics, particularly the Battle of Cannae, where they went and encircled the Roman army with a force which was about half that of the Romans, and he was still harking back onto that and described it as a kind of beautiful piece of art. And often, you see kind of generals, including Napoleon as well, who then try to, go and hark back and use the same kind of military tactics. So it goes to show, even though in today's world we might not necessarily always kind of think of it, that's one example of, where the idea really does originate and it becomes to the main kind of form in the classical era. And then you still see, particularly going back to, I would say it'd be fair to say about 50 years ago, when you had particularly, those who were the higher echelon society, they all studied classics. They were very well aware, and instances and tactics like that went and affected those with a military mindset. And those people who are much more in culture and literature, they would look much back to then. And all of the, for example, all of the major political figures, such as a poster of one of them behind myself, such as Churchill. He was very heavily influenced as well by classics, as were many of his peers. So yeah, it goes to show, just in terms of the importance, I think, in terms of classics it had upon our era, because people such as Churchill and many of his other peers, such as Attlee, went and shaped today's world, and they were very much influenced by the days of classics. And you mentioned democracy there. Sorry, what would you think? Would be? I think you outlined some of the key differences. But when you look at the world today, and you see, for example, what the terrible scenes which we saw in the United States a couple of days ago, does that kind of remind you of any classical era? Because we look at that and we say that's completely and utterly unprecedented. But if you look at much of the ancient era, did things like that happen in ancient Greece?
I mean, I guess that does make you think of, like, in ancient Greece, there's these figures, the sort of demagogues and like sophists, these kind of like rhetoricians who are seen as quite dangerous people because they can like whip the mob. I guess hoi polloi comes from Greek. It's just like the people, the masses. They can whip like the masses into to do what they want using like persuasion and for their own ends. And that's pretty familiar from what's happening with Donald Trump and has happened with him. But I think also it's kind of interesting, the debates that you find in like Plato, where he sets up different. I think mainly it's happening in the Republic, where they're debating different kind of political systems and which one's the best. And there's definitely. He's always kind of debating with sophists, and the sophists kind of come off worse, and they're shown to have not really much moral fiber, and they're kind of just in it. They don't really believe in truth. They believe more in, exactly like Donald Trump. They believe in, what truth is, whatever you can make people believe, rather than any kind of absolute truth. And that's it's very poignant today. But there's one, I think it's Thrasymachus, is this kind of character who pops up in quite a lot of the dialogues, and he believes in might is right. So he subscribes to this view that whoever's the strongest should be in charge, and whatever the strongest person wants to do, they've got the right to do it. So that person can kill someone, they can torture someone, but because if they're the strongest and they have the most strength behind them, then that's right, because might is right. That's like totally his view. And if you're weak, then you're in trouble, basically. And that's kind of a scary idea, that someone would ever think that, you know, subscribe to that idea. And yet, you know, people do kind of seem to subscribe to these kind of weird ideas where there's morally they seem completely corrupt. But yeah, there's been people like that around for a long time. And I guess the thing with the classics is, whereas people have probably been like around like that in all cultures, we've got a lot of, you know, like Plato's dialogues and things that people are quite familiar with, where you see it playing out, and it's set out in a very clear artistic way of these different kind of extreme arguments for different political systems and different kind of figures like Donald Trump, where you see them, I don't know, presented a bit in caricature, but they've been about, you know, forever, as long as there's been sort of human society, I guess.
For sure, and I think this is at points with modern society, and you know, when we were discussing, you know, the fact that we live in a golden age, it almost feels like we're also living in an age where, and maybe people would disagree with me on this, but you know, where we've almost forgotten history to an extent, and we've forgotten, you know, long old truths like that. And I think Trump is a pertinent example, and I think we've forgotten in terms of you know, clear rules. And I think this was very much, you know, well documented in the United States, and I think we've seen, I think maybe, and I hope it is, you know, the final culmination in terms of what we've seen in the Capitol. I won't go beyond that. That might just be a bit of a hopeful thought, but I think what we've seen from both sides is we essentially see both sides to use, I think, a phrase, stir the mob and stir their own parts of supporters. So, you know, on the left of the United States, you see Antifa, and quite often, you know, after the terrible murder of George Floyd, and then some justified protests about that, we then saw quite a lot of those protests, to be frank, turn into riots, and people who had no association with those protests whatsoever then riot and loot. And the Democrat side of the House, many of them essentially ignore that because it suited their own political ends. And then, you know, you look at the other side and you see some horrific groups such as, you know, for example, the Proud Boys, who I think were involved in the storming of the Capitol building. And you see a figure such as Trump continuously stir it and essentially invite the mob to go and march up to the White House. And I think what both sides have clearly forgotten there is two essential fundamental lessons, which is first of all, that be careful when you stir the mob, because that brings me on to the second point, which is, well, you can't control it. Once, I know, you know, there was probably a failure of policing in terms of when the Capitol building was stormed, but equally it goes to show that, you know, if you have thousands of people suddenly go and surge, particularly if, you know, those thousands of people are potentially have kind of arms themselves, really. And this is the thing with democracy, it is government by consent. It has the consent of the people. And if, you know, a sizable amount of that people is stirred up, then it's very hard for the government, to go and control that. And then you have disorder and chaos. And this is something, you know, which I think our forefathers and future generations were very well aware of, and they often go and sought to avoid. And so, you know, they would have compromise, and the two political parties be much better at building bridges. Whereas it seems like those kinds of fundamental lessons have been forgotten, and now it's quite an aggressive form of politics. And it's I think there's a comedian, Paul Burr, who put it very well, and he's somebody, you know, who's not interested in politics. He said basically what both sides seem to do now is go and call out whenever the other side does something wrong, and then go and completely ignore it when their side does something wrong. It's a very dangerous place to lead to, because all paths like that, essentially, at the end of the day, will lead to chaos, and one side aggressively winning out over the other. And I hope it doesn't get that far, but it feels like it was inevitable what was going to happen. Segue us on perfectly onto something, Phil, which is one problem which I think looking at today's society is the lack of good leaders, the lack of proper leadership. If you look in the past, I think in the modern history, you know, good leaders, it appears like compared to now, they were in abundance. So this kind of ties, I think, very nicely into your kind of knowledge about Alexander the Great. and in terms of, you know, what lessons we can maybe take from his era and his style, both good and bad, and put it in today. So if you could maybe, you know, tell us a little bit about Alexander the Great in terms of who he was and what exactly he accomplished at such a young age.
Yeah, I think he's kind of a fascinating figure because, I mean, first off, you should probably say that he overall he was not a good person. He didn't do good things. He invaded countries. He was responsible for some massacres. He was a warmonger, and all of the none of those things are things that are particularly none of those things are things that you would really want to celebrate. But I guess the thing that is fascinating about him is like the I guess the amount of kind of adversity that he overcame, the total kind of loyalty that he inspired in people to the point where they do things that were, life-threatening, for him. And I guess his charisma, his luck, his kind of hardiness of just coming through things that would have, that require huge kind of physical, mental strength. I think so. It's kind of this paradox of someone who's kind of absolutely fascinating, and his story is kind of got lots of, the makings of a great story, which has like huge amounts of luck, survival, coming through, incredible adventures, and then also it's got all this kind of savagery, and that I suppose I guess what I'm getting at is that what he was aiming to do was terrible, but the way he did it and the stories along the way are kind of really fascinating.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess if we're talking about kind of good leaders, then yeah, he's someone who you couldn't really get someone who inspired more kind of loyalty than him really in the history books. So yeah, he's pretty fascinating. He's certainly, yeah, you can't really imagine Boris Johnson inspiring that kind of loyalty, or David Cameron, who I think are both kind of modern figures who has been kind of documented that they'll kind of go with the flow a bit, and they're quite fluid with what they believe in, and that they'll kind of move to the whether it's Brexit or whatever they seem to think is kind of the most advantageous to their political career. Whereas I guess you've got these kind of figures like Alexander the Great that are completely singular, and absolutely they knew what they wanted, and they were just going to go and do it, and and that's what their entire life is built around, and they inspired everyone to come with them. It's it's quite, if you compare it in that way, it's quite interesting to compare some modern figures with people like that.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure what exactly Cameron ever believed in, but it's interesting actually, because you mentioned in terms of, Alexander and the bad side, in terms of the fact that I guess he was a conqueror, ultimately. But just to push back slightly, I guess on that, I'll put you on the spot a little bit. I think Obama said something quite sage. This was a couple of years ago when he was speaking about the woke movement, and he had a warning in terms of, for example, not essentially trying to put yourself on too much of a kind of moral pedestal, and trying to go and understand figures in today's world and countries in today's world is in the correct context, and otherwise understanding that the world is grey and it's an extremely messy and tricky place, and often the kind of morals, rights and wrongs which you expect to see, and the kind of moral right and wrongs which you insist and we try and live our lives by, so you have to at points I guess understand that life is not simple, and you can't always, I guess, sit in moral judgment on other people. Do you think, to what extent can we therefore sit in moral kind of judgment over someone like Alexander? Because after all, is that time and era not a time of conquest? If Alexander had not done the conquering, would Greece not have been conquered? And then likewise as well, if you look at, his father, in Macedon, surely if they had not done the conquering, then they themselves would have been in line to be conquered. And actually, that's quite a recent phenomenon in terms of the fact that we now look upon that in much more of a harsh light. Much of history was about who would rule over the other, who would be victorious. And I guess this was secondly leading me on to kind of another way of judging Alexander, which is, and you'll know more about this, which is I get the fact that he was a supreme military commander. In some ways, I guess he had definitely a lot of vices. I think you're right about that. But also, he achieved a lot in the military sense. But what did he actually achieve? And this will be my second question, in terms of, one, can we judge him? And to what extent can we take it? And when we judge him, are you judging him through the classical context, or are you judging him in a much more of a modern context? And then also, secondly, what did he achieve apart from military victories?
Yeah, I think that's a good point about a different kind of time for how people treated military victories and things like that. I mean, for the Macedonians were particularly guilty of very aggressive expansionism, and they kind of used this kind of narrative of being under threat from the Persian Empire and the East as excuses, but that was mainly just rhetoric, really.
Okay.
It's kind of they were, as far as ancient people go, that it was a pretty bald kind of just, we're going to conquer people because that but that's it's a violent man in a violent time, doing violent things against other people who are violent. I think it's hard to kind of judge in that way. I think an interesting way of thinking about it, though, is kind of the way that is kind of important to think of it in that way, because he's so these kind of figures like Alexander the Great can be so kind of influential on people and the way they see the world, that I think it's important to have a balanced view. And that what's interesting about Alexander is that he kind of had that from the past. So he used to sleep with the Iliad by Homer like under his pillow. He was like completely obsessed with Achilles and all these ancient heroes and ancient glory, and that kind of shaped from a young age, and that kind of shaped his psychology and what he was interested in. And then since then, obviously, these figures like Alexander the Great and people like that have shaped, other kind of leaders, and I mean, Napoleon, I'm sure he saw himself as kind of an Alexander the Great figure. So it's kind of, it's an interesting one of sort of acknowledging that he was a violent man in a violent time, but then also being wary of people who kind of hero worship Alexander and people like that, and then they kind of get brainwashed into kind of emulating him and his deeds, as if all of his deeds were good, when obviously they're in the modern times that they weren't. And with was the second question about what else he did, this kind of links in with it, because he basically went off on a trail of looking for glory, and he didn't ever come back. He died on his mission. And there's these stories that he would quite often be found crying because he was dreaming about all the places in the world that he hadn't conquered. And he was always thinking of the next place, the next place, the next place. And the further he got, the more his men said, like, we want to go home now. We've conquered. You can't really say that the Persian Empire is going to come and attack us, because we've conquered all of the Persian Empire. We've conquered all these different places. Like, why are we still going? And then he was like, no, I want to go to India. I want to go. He had this kind of idea of going, as far as anyone had ever gone, or further than anyone had ever gone. And there's these stories about Dionysus, the god, coming from India, and the Greek god. So he wanted to go, he needed to get that far because Dionysus had got that far, and get further. So it was kind of a very individualistic thing that he went on, and he didn't really, in terms of politics, he did nothing really. It was people back home taking care of things for him, and he never came back. So it was his life was just one massive adventure from when he left until He died when he was like 33. So it's quite a yeah, again, like a kind of amazing adventure story, but yeah, not one to emulate maybe in the modern time.
I think you're very right in terms of yeah the kind of danger in I think only looking at the successes and being quite easily seduced by that. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned Napoleon. I'm not going to name the historian, but I read it's a wonderfully detailed account. But I found myself when I was reading it often kind of disagreeing with the historian who wrote it because I got the impression that they deeply admired Napoleon to such an extent that they were overlooking his flaws and they were overlooking the fact that Napoleon was particularly when you look at things such as the invasion of Russia in those later years, Napoleon was essentially, I think he had the phrase, one must not ask more from fortune, one must not ask, sorry, fortune more than she can grant. A rare moment of humility for Napoleon, but I think when you kind of study it, by that era, there were alternative philosophical and political opinions. There were often people within the French government who wanted Napoleon just to kind of wait, not immediately commit to war. There were other kind of European monarchs who wanted much more of a kind of peaceful resolution. Once Napoleon fell, Europe then had a period of relative peace, thereby showing it's possible. And essentially, Napoleon was a much more classical conqueror, but France suffered enormously due to that. All kinds of young boys, particularly towards the end, suffered. His kind of great army was wiped out in Russia. The suffering which Russia had to have, the suffering which was inflicted on areas such as Spain. By the end of Napoleon's reign, you'll become more and more sympathetic, at least in my opinion, with the Allies who wanted to kind of put him on a little island somewhere and kind of keep him there. And you can see why, because he became a danger, and it felt like he was acting more like an Alexander the Great, who was getting more inspired by these figures essentially who just wanted to go and conquer and couldn't necessarily see their own vices. But I think my point would be, in that time and era, you can kind of see all of the political and all of the cultural alternatives to what Napoleon was doing, while also kind of understanding the fact that, yeah, sure, the kind of, where France in that post-revolution period was in a dangerous place. And maybe, to an element in the early days, Napoleon was justified before being seduced by his own image. But in the classic context, what were the alternatives to what Alexander wanted to do? What were I guess you could say these figures of wisdom who had the ability to not only succeed militarily, which was probably necessary in that time, but also had above all the wisdom to govern as well?
Yeah, I guess it's interesting looking back at ancient wisdom with kind of modern eyes, because I don't think there was ever certainly in no sort of ancient Greek philosophers who were kind of open to other cultures. There's this kind of inherent racism running through all Greek philosophy, as far as I ever came across, in terms of kind of like othering people who aren't Greek. And that's things like that's where like barbarian comes from, because they just saw anyone who wasn't speaking Greek as making the noise ba 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 ba, like, so they called them barbaroi. So that's where barbarian comes from. So it was this kind of, in terms of kind of ancient foreign policy, it would go as far as trade, obviously, but I guess a certain level of respect for certain. They were pretty fascinated by Egyptian culture, but like a general kind of othering of anyone who wasn't sort of Greek, which is from a modern point of view quite shocking. There was obviously slavery was a kind of inherent part of the ancient world, which is shocking for us now. But yeah, I guess they could have aimed for more peace. I don't know. I mean, I guess that's why kind of Athens is a more fascinating place, because although there were so many things, restrictions put on voting, there was a bit of the kind of the will of the people represented by that, even if it wasn't all of them, which is kind of a unique idea. Whereas in places like Macedon, it's completely about the elites and the kings and whatever they want to do, and if you just have to fall in line. So it's it's a pretty different world. I think that's part of what it's easy to forget that, because classics have been so influential on like modern thinkers and writers and architects and the culture of the Renaissance and going into the modern time, is that you almost think about all these ideas as kind of modern ideas, or that they must have come from a time which was quite similar. But then you kind of think about all the things which we now would think were completely abhorrent, like slavery, that you're like, oh God, it is such a distant, in some ways so close, but in some ways like completely distant to modern society.
For sure, yeah. I mean, it's kind of, and this would just be rowed back slightly on Alexander, but important maybe to understand where Alexander came from. But my very limited understanding of ancient Greece would be that Athens was the one, in terms of where we get many of the kind of democratic ideas and the ideas of governance. But Macedon or modern day Macedonia, they were often regarded by the other Greeks as being quite harsh and quite barbarous. I mean, the kind of famous comparison would be that they would drink pure wine, down south. The other Greeks would drink watered down wine. And it was Macedon in the end who went and conquered the others. So therefore, would it be the equivalent of, I don't know, the kind of harder, the kind of like, let's say, more kind of ruthless part of one world conquering the other part of the world nearby, and then changing the kind of dynamic?
Yeah. There's an element of that. As far as I've kind of learned about Macedon, they were pretty hard living people, hardy and like hard drinking, and they had incredible cavalry, incredible like horses from where they lived in those plains, and they developed a kind of a new type of warfare with like a particularly long spear that they developed with the cavalry into being extremely effective. And yeah, probably I think that they're just general kind of hardiness in the culture of enduring hardship and being hard living people was part of what led to their kind of success as well militarily, and overthrowing all the different Greek states. And also, I guess, in the context of the history of Greece, it kind of came at a time where Sparta and Athens had kind of all their kind of strength had kind of dissipated. They'd had the Persian Wars, and then these really lengthy Peloponnesian Wars between Sparta and Athens, where they kind of, a lot of their money and resources were kind of spent, and there had been like a terrible plague certainly in Athens. I'm not sure whether it spread to Sparta, but there's this kind of terrible plague that hits Athens, and kind of all these kind of different things really saw those empires in decline, or military powers in decline, which is the vacuum which Macedon kind of stepped into later on. And then after they had their time, then Rome kind of steps into that vacuum. So it's in that context of kind of coming down upon some military powers that had seen their kind of their brightest days go basically.
One great power hands over to the next power as well.
I'm going to turn a light on.
Yeah, saw the lighter, no worries.
It's better. It's a bit lighter.
Perfect stuff. I mean, I do in just 1 second want to maybe kind of speak about why Alexandria is kind of important today, and maybe what are the lessons which we can take from. But one thing that's often struck me when kind of reading about him is he comes across as ironically a bit of a tragic figure in the end. He seems to have these significant bouts of depression. It seems like after he's concluded much of his conquering, he falls out a little bit with himself. He seems to have these dark clouds that come over him. It seems like he can never be satisfied. And is it fair to say that towards the end he maybe saw, if you want, the fallacy in his position in terms of what he was trying to achieve? And as well, I think it seems to be young too. It seems to be a kind of young man who is incredibly talented, quite brutal, who takes on all of these opportunities and succeeds, but it's never satisfied. He never goes and achieves that happiness. And did he maybe towards the end kind of realize that it takes more than just, you know, that kind of individualistic self-satisfaction. It takes more than just that to achieve true happiness.
Yeah, definitely. It is a tale of someone who is completely insatiable, and that eventually they can't ever be happy because nothing's ever enough. I think it's there's the documentary, the Michael Wood documentary. I think there's various different ancient biographies of Alexander, but the one that I think he's reading is Arian, where in the Greek he talks about Alexander's pothos a lot, which is basically like a kind of a really burning desire that's just really kind of like guides everything you do, because it's so strong inside you. And it's always talking about his pothos is to conquer and to go to the next place, to find the next people to conquer. And it's that kind of, that makes him a tragic figure, that he's completely, I mean, I guess it's quite relevant to what we were saying about consumerism. He's like the ultimate consumer. It's never enough for him. And there is a sense that at the end he's kind of become disillusioned with, you know, there's never enough. There's never enough kind of places he can conquer. I think there's also that sense that he thought he'd find the ends of the earth, and then he kind of keeps going and going and going and going, and he realizes that maybe he's never going to find the end of the earth, that the world is much, much bigger than he ever imagined, and that he's just not going to be able to see all of it and conquer all of it. And there's always that kind of worry that he's not going to be, you know, as famous as he wants to be. He wants to be, you know, the most famous person, you know, the most famous warrior, the most famous king. And he doesn't seem like a very happy figure. And he kind of, there's this theme running throughout his kind of his life, which gets greater and greater as he goes on, of these huge drinking bouts that he used to do.
Yes.
Where he kind of, as he goes on, he gets more and more, they become more frequent and more kind of go on for longer, kind of days at a time. And he likes to speak about, you know, philosophy and discuss these different matters and meet different people, like different kings and things, in these huge kind of drunken symposium. But and that kind of seems to have more and more of an effect on his health. And then there's this kind of, the way that he dies, it's kind of not clear whether either he was poisoned or it kind of comes straight after another kind of huge drinking bout that went on for days. And then he kind of goes swimming in a freezing cold river, and he comes out and he gets a fever and he dies. And it's, you know, did he actually have a fever, or was he poisoned? Or actually, was it because he had done himself such damage from drinking so much that he did catch a fever from the river, and his immune system was in a bad place, and he did die from that. So it's interesting how, like you say, he's not a happy person. He's always pushing on to the next thing. And I suppose that there's maybe an element of that in lots of people, but also in people who are extremely intelligent or extreme, like kind of overachievers, that they find everything so easy that there's a point where they're like, there's no challenge anymore, or they can't find happiness in anything, because they're just always trying to find the next challenge to get through.
Sure. I mean, first of all, what do you think in terms of Alexander's death? Is it more likely that it was poisoned, or was it more likely that it was natural causes?
It's difficult, because there were definitely attempts on his life, and kind of the longer it went on and the more that he refused to turn back with all his troops, there was, you know, people becoming discontented, and there were kind of assassination attempts which weren't successful. So there's definitely motivation there for someone to poison him. But then at the same time, it does just add up that maybe he's caught some disease his body wasn't really used to, and he was in a state of he wasn't very healthy at that point, and it did kill him.
Yeah.
I think I've always leant more towards just believing that it was just a natural thing, that he just caught something from the river and he'd just pushed himself too hard, and died. But I mean, kind of physical endurance is something again that sort of comes up again and again in his story of like, there's this kind of siege in, I think it might be India or the outskirts, just as they're getting into India, where his men are kind of holding back from this. They're besieging the city, and the men are kind of not very willing to go in and try and scale the walls. So he then just goes off on his own, scales the walls, and he's in the city fighting on his own. And obviously, because they love him so much, all the men then follow afterwards. But by doing that, he gets quite badly injured, and obviously that's something, that a wound that he'd be carrying and would weaken him. They go through the desert at one point where loads of his men die from dehydration, and there's this kind of story about him refusing any water because he wants to be on the same level as his foot soldiers, and not to be seen to be given any kind of anything, to be avoiding any of the hardships that they're going through. So I can imagine at that point in his life, after drinking really, really heavily as well for a number of years, as he got more and more into that, I can imagine he probably wasn't in the best shape in terms of, like his immune system, and just being kind of like seriously worn down, and kind of an illness and things. So I can imagine it being caused by illness rather than poisoning.
For sure. I mean, we were touching it. I think we were touching it, but just upon there. So I think that we probably captured quite well his vices and maybe his quite tragic character. But what are his virtues, and what are the good things about Alexander, and what are the kind of lessons which we can take from that even today?
I think it's interesting going back to what we were saying about how there's now a culture where politicians can't really say that they've got something wrong, or it's very rare to hear them say that. There's definitely kind of these occasions in Alexander's stories where he's full of regret, or he acts in quite a humble way. Or he shows kind of mercy to people. There's this story about when he, after the kind of big battle with Darius, they've got Darius's wife and children there, I think, and the wife kind of bows to Hephaestion, who's his kind of lover and his closest friend, and he takes it really well. He says like, oh, he's basically another Alexander. Like, he doesn't get offended by it, and he treats them very well, and doesn't like a lot of people, his men were kind of calling for them to be butchered or whatever for the crimes of the empire against Greece, but he treats them very well. There's other occasions where he says that I was wrong. I just and kind of regret over what certain instances, or he's had someone murdered and he's full of regret. So it's kind of, I don't know, I suppose they're things that you probably shouldn't have done in the first place, but he's kind of, he is someone who's got his fallibility and of his human nature does come across quite a lot in the story, and the kind of and the kind of the love of his men, and there's obviously the story in the desert, and then when I think after he's been wounded, the first thing he does is he wants to go and check on all his men, things like that. That kind of dedication to the common man, or people in his army, is kind of, I wonder though, I mean, this is sort of playing devil's advocate, but I don't know whether how much of that is him almost, it's almost like he was living his own story of being a hero, and whether how much of his behavior was kind of guided by what would make a good story, because almost like he kind of, I don't know, I feel like almost everything he did, he was always thinking about his legacy, and that kind of guided his actions.
Well, I guess that is something which is often true for great figures throughout history. They're often have a sense of destiny about them, and often they do believe in their own destiny, and often they're
Yeah.
inspired by other heroic tales. And it's a good question, which is, are they doing it more out of the goodness of their hearts, or are they trying to fulfill their own heroic status? But then can you flip that and say, well, the fact that they're trying to fulfill their own heroic status is in a way a good thing, because it's meaning that they're doing more good virtues, and perhaps it's not realistic to think that people always do things purely out of the own goodness of their hearts, particularly people such as Alexander. And I think it was an interesting thing you mentioned in terms of his fallibility makes him quite attractive and quite accessible. I think even in the modern day, if you look at things such as sporting heroes, somebody such as Gascoigne is very much loved in Britain. I mean, part of the reason he's loved is that he feels like one of us. He feels like the kind of a fan. I know you used to like your 90s football era, but he feels like a kind of fan looking, and Diego Maradona, perfect example of that. Deeply flawed individual, arguably the greatest player of all time. Well, one of the reasons it seems that he was loved so much is because he was a much more of a flawed genius, than somebody such as, I don't know, Cristiano Ronaldo, who I know is loved in Portugal, but in terms of that global appeal, that kind of nation being obsessed by him, there was definitely something about Diego Maradona and the fact that he was so flawed that in a way made people love him more. So is it fair to say that of Alexander, the fact that he is flawed, the fact that you can relate to him, means that it's easier in a way to have whatever some of his bad actions were, to have a kind of it's almost like it goes against your kind of instincts, but because he's flawed, you immediately relate to him, and therefore you have, I guess, some people would have more love for him for that reason.
It's true, yeah. You kind of, no matter what's going on, when things like that, when someone's failing at something or they can admit their wrongs and stuff, you get kind of drawn into their story and you start rooting for them, not really as the underdog, but you kind of, it's something to relate to, yeah. So you kind of, if his story was just that he went east, he killed loads, had all these battles that he was successful at, and he just, he massacred lots of people. He wouldn't give in to his military might, and then that was it. That was the whole story. I think it wouldn't, yeah, he wouldn't be such an enduring figure. Probably Napoleon would have loved him, and Hitler was obsessed with the classics, and Alexander as well. But it's all the kind of other, the ways that he fails or he has regret, and the way that he feels like he's never fulfilled, that makes it much more of a human tragedy, and much more interesting for people who aren't really interested in but emulating someone on a military level.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you kind of mentioned, I guess, Hitler there, and I think that's why one of the reasons why Hitler is such a dislikable figure, and as much for the Nazi administration, it feels like, and when you study them, there's nothing to them apart from their fascist ideology, and that makes them much more dislikable. Apart from the fact that they were abhorrent human beings, it's the fact that there's nothing to them apart from their poisonous ideology. It's almost like the kind of perfect form of evil at that point manifests itself over Germany. There's no redeeming features, but I mean, another kind of question I want to ask you about Alexander is, you mentioned the fallibility, but you kind of mentioned some other, I guess, tropes there, such as bravery, triumph in adversity, suffering what his men wanted to suffer. I think particularly for many young men, would you say those are quite, attractive kind of qualities? It's almost, within you as a young man to try and be brave and try and prove yourself. And is it fair to say Alexander did that and was doing that and managed to achieve that, and that's another thing that makes him quite an attractive figure?
Yeah, I guess there's any story where it's like a triumph over the odds, where someone who has just got into a situation like a huge battle where they're completely outnumbered, and they just went ahead with extremely kind of brave and sort of massive gambles, which paid off in terms of like huge kind of cavalry charges where they're at the front, and it's just like all or nothing, like death or glory. I think it's hard not to find that fascinating as well. Like you say, there's something, there's kind of an appeal to that for young men and people, just because I don't know. I guess maybe it does go back again a little bit to what we were saying about how, life's so complicated and there's so many grey areas and things, and then there's definitely points in life where everyone wishes things were sort of super simple, and that you just had when you have a definite purpose and you pursue that with absolutely everything you've got, and all that matters is that purpose, and nothing else matters. It's that or death, and you have absolutely no fear at all, and no kind of second thoughts. I think that's such a sort of powerful idea that people almost are attracted to it, although they're not planning on becoming military leaders and invading a country. There's something about the power of that kind of singularity of intent that does appeal to people when most people's day to day can be quite mundane, and
Sure.
and I guess and the reason he's appealed to the Nazis and Napoleon is the sense of power, which which can be very corrupting and can appeal to the worst types of people as well. But there's a lot of that is attractive. Someone who was that who had that kind of sense of of self kind of power, and they were just going to get done what they wanted to set out to do, and they just did it, no matter how big the challenge. It's something, that kind of theme is always interesting, I think.
Did you actually know? I don't actually. I only kind of learned this recently when I was studying the Nazis, which is whereas someone like Napoleon was very much aware of ancient history, people like the Nazis were surprisingly quite ignorant of much of history and the historical figures before. Much of it, I didn't actually fully kind of realised that. But this is a very interesting thing actually when you study someone such as Hitler, which is, he knows much about German history, and he has a kind of strange respect at points for Britain and for France, but his lack of understanding of other cultures, of history itself, is quite striking. He has the kind of ego to think that he can understand history, but actually his kind of lack of historical knowledge is quite evident. When you do, which is something which I hadn't really kind of realised before. I guess it's why he's a bit more of an exceptional figure when you put in that, and maybe that's part of the reason why he did such an enormous range of terrible things that he did. But yeah, I was quite surprised to learn that.
Maybe
well.
I guess he didn't. Maybe it's partly he didn't take an interest in. He took what he wanted, and he was because the Nazis were very sort of selective about,
yes,
or certainly Hitler, about what they wanted to take from history, and they used that very kind of effectively. And there's this kind of some obsession with figures from the classical past like Alexander, but also with like this idea of the Vikings and this kind of Aryan race and all that kind of nonsense. They kind of took what they wanted from history, and they didn't really worry about the facts. they were more into the how can those ideas be twisted to get people to support a war and to support racist ideologies. It's kind of fascinating, the way that people think, and the way you can get them to think is kind of at the root of a lot of historical actions, which seem completely insane, that you can't even understand how a country could get behind something, but at the root of it's psychological rather than anything material that they were kind of tempted with.
It
So,
is,
very
it's
weird.
for sure, yeah, and I think that's one of the things which is often disturbing me about hardline communism as well. Which is, if you look at the Mao period in China, they try to essentially forget the past. Likewise, in Cambodia, under the terrible reign of Pol Pot, likewise they went and essentially killed anyone who they thought was intellectual. They
Yeah.
went and tried to completely and utterly destroy the past. And in a way, actually, you see similar happen in Nazi Germany, kind of book burning, burning any kind of literature which they don't agree with, and that really is a kind of fundamental, I think, lesson from modern history, which is generally when you see societies or governments doing that, it's never a good sign. It doesn't matter, what part of the political spectrum you're on. When essentially history, is thrown under the carpet by a government or by people in society, that tells you a lot about the element of society or that government, and it's never really a good thing. Let's
Yeah.
just say. Whereas look at other governments, and they very much try. I think you'd have to say the majority of kings and rulers in the past did have an understanding of ancient history, and certainly would you say it's true? I think one other striking thing about Alexander is the fact that he was inspired by some of the main kind of Greek writers at the past, right? Or there were some major kind of
Yeah,
Greek
he was.
writers, philosophers who tried to influence him at a young age.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, this was kind of another weird aspect of his stories, that he was tutored by Aristotle when he was very young, so he had that kind of background in Greek philosophy. And then yeah, he was just completely obsessed with the Iliad, which is quite telling, because he could have had um, other texts under his pillow about more philosophical things. He could have had the
Yes.
Odyssey under his pillow because it's more to do with adventure and seeing new countries and meeting new people. But what he was completely obsessed with was this kind of, particularly Achilles from the Iliad, this figure who just is a killing machine, and is obsessed with the kind of the glory that he can gain and how he'll be remembered for his
Yeah.
military glory after he's died. And then that kind of plays out in Alexander's life. So yeah, that definitely played a big role. Like how he thought and what he read completely shaped his life. Yeah.
He seems to be quite boyish in a way. I
Yeah.
mean, in a maybe a bit of a terrible way, but it feels like at points, and this is a very modern way of looking at it, but from a modern perspective, you'll kind of almost want them to put those books of adventure away and try and use that amongst other kind of learnings.
Yeah, I guess I mean, I suppose, to try and do a bit of thinking about it in his favor, there was kind of, the further east he went, the part of the reason he was falling out with his men is that he would adopt kind of local customs of,
Mm.
he was adopting kind of Persian dress, and he was very interested in the locals, whereas his kind of commanders, most of them felt that, these are people that you've conquered, and they're to be subjugated, not to be kind of respected or shown any kind of respect, and that kind of idea that they're worried that the cultures that they'd conquered were actually conquering them because of the influence it was having over Alexander in terms of his habits and the way he dressed and things like that. So I suppose you could argue that there was an element of him becoming more culturally aware from his adventures and becoming more kind of open to ideas outside of his upbringing. To what extent you can really say that that bedded into a more kind of modern point of view, I don't know, but certainly he was ahead of things compared to a lot of his kind of commanders. He would just conquer, and they're completely separate people who aren't interesting to us.
Nice.
Yeah.
So maybe probably coming towards the ends here, but maybe would you kind of say, when you summarize, that Alexander's a good figure to go and study in history? Because Alexander the Great, yes. Alexander the Good, probably not. But nonetheless, that's why his tale is so fascinating, because in a way you've almost got it's quite a human tale, as in he does some good, but there's also a considerable amount of bad. There's lots of kind of ego within there. There's considerable amounts of adventure, but ultimately maybe there's quite a lot of tragedy within there too.
Yeah.
Would you say that's a fair way of looking at it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just the stories have all those elements in them, and it's just yeah, it's amazing to read about all those different things and see how they've influenced other people and what kind of aspects resonate with you and what thing, ask yourself how you feel about this character. As you read through the stories, you're kind of, on the one hand, you're kind of absolutely horrified by the things he's doing, and then other times you're kind of really, you feel kind of quite moved by what you're hearing about what he's doing and how he reacted to certain situations. So it's a kind of, yeah, in that, it's, in a way, it's quite modern in that way, that now so many kind of TV programs and films really strive to have characters that are, three-dimensional. They're not just this one kind of person. That's something I've really noticed in more modern kind of TV series and films, is that, like Walter White in Breaking Bad, he's a terrible figure, and yet he's fascinating, and there's all these kind of aspects of him which might resonate with you, and it might kind of worry you that they do with you, or that, and then other things that you're like, oh no, that's terrible, and it raises questions and starts dialogues in a way with yourself and other people about, what do we think of this person, what was good and what was bad and what was going on, and are there elements of him in other people that, politicians or other people that we know, in like managers or whatever that you work with, or, in to a lesser degree, these human traits. So yeah, I definitely encourage people to read about Alexander. Yeah.
I mean, that's why Breaking Bad's, not to get too sidetracked, but such a fascinating series, and it's a very intelligent series. I mean, not to give too much of the kind of game away, but if somebody who hasn't, shock horror, seen it, but that's why it's interesting. I mean, I think at the start it's very clever, particularly the first time you're watching it, in terms of getting the audience to sympathise with Walter White, whereas characters such as Jesse Pinkman or Hanks, another very good one, you sympathise with less. But then as the series kind of reaches its dramatic conclusion, suddenly, Hanks becomes a figure of principle, and Jesse becomes a much more of a character of heart, and a good heart at that. Whereas Walter's the one who you suddenly realise towards the end is actually the more kind of cold, calculating monster, and it becomes much more of a kind of cautionary tale in terms of a character who could have potentially done good, but always had deep within him the potential to do bad, ends up doing just that. And I think it's a very kind of true tale as well. But just to kind of round off, Phil, a question I'd probably like to ask you, in terms of, we're looking, in today's quite tortured world, for lessons to take. What is, and this will be a hard question, but what is, one lesson you would maybe like to take from the time of Alexander, or indeed anywhere in the ancient world? What is a kind of lesson or learning you would like to maybe kind of you'd kind of take from that, and you'd like to see maybe applied in the modern day?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the thing that I'd like to take from Alexander, or that you could do despite the context of what he was doing, is the kind of indomitable spirit. I think that's probably the most impressive aspects of the whole story, is just the kind of level of challenges that he overcame again and again and again. And it's almost, I mean, to caveat this, there's obviously an element of fantasy to the ancient text, but in general, they're relating like historical things that happened, and some of the details have probably been tweaked to sound a bit more heroic. But yeah, just the fact that what you're reading actually happened, and that someone was that kind of combination of lucky and just kind of hardy, and just wouldn't give up at all, is fascinating. And then obviously we've spoken about kind of Rome in the past, and that's kind of another thing that comes up with kind of Roman military history, is that just the kind of the relentlessness and just not giving in, that I think is something that, in more general terms, like all humans can kind of admire and think, you know, I wonder how I would fare in that situation. Like, how well would I do? You know, what have I got? You know, when it's life and death. You know, what have I got inside me? To how far would I go? I think that's probably the most interesting thing to take away from it for me.
For sure. All right, perfect. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you, Phil. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
I
thanks
hope
for having me.
anyone. That's okay. I'd be delighted to have you back on in the near future, hopefully in better times. But that is enough from us. So thank you very much, guys. Cheers for listening, and
Thanks.
all the best.